So the DMA lecture recital project is one of the culminating degree requirements for the degree. It's something that will take considerable amount of time and energy. It is much more substantial than a typical term paper, and in many ways challenges you both in your research skills, your writing, and of course in performance in the presentation of the lecture recital itself. So there are two components to the project: a substantial paper that is very informed by research, as well as a presentation which is half lecture and half performance. As I said, the paper is preceded by a period of considerable research when you are investigating your topic, reading everything there is to know about it, gaining a degree of expertise that will inform the writing process. So the first thing I want to do is just share with you, I sent this to you previously, but I'll put it in the chat here, the syllabus for this course, which has a lot of this information that I'm about to convey, and some other helpful guidance as well. You should make sure to read the syllabus so that way you're clear on the expectations and requirements for the project. So the first thing is registration. You have to register for lecture recital advisement in every semester in which you are working with your advisor. So if you are meeting with your advisor to discuss topics, if you're sending outlines, if you're doing revisions on drafts, if you are discussing the mechanics of the presentation, any way in which you're working with your advisor, you should be registered for lecture recital advisement. Most students will register probably 2 to 3 semesters. There are some, every once in a while, there's someone who could do it in 1 semester. And there are quite a few who've taken more than 3 semesters, but I would say 3 on average is kind of the goal for the number of semesters that this project will take. Now, I mentioned that you have to register for lecture recital advisement in every semester that you're working with the advisor. One thing that you might want to keep in mind, an incentive to maybe finish up by certain checkpoints, is that if you have finished your paper before the start of a semester, at least finished it and gained approval from your advisor, you can register for a 0-credit class called Matriculation Continued, rather than registering for the 1-credit lecture recital advisement. So this means, let's say you're working on your paper and you're making a lot of progress, and it's July, and you think, okay, I might be able to finish before the start of the semester, or it might take me a little while longer. If you're able to get your applied teacher to approve the paper before the start of the semester, then you can avoid paying the extra credit of tuition. So there's financial incentive to finishing a paper, the paper before a semester begins. Does that make sense? If that doesn't make sense, you can just interrupt me.
Rob,
yes.
could I just interrupt there to make sure it's clear that you should not expect that your faculty are available over the summer for advising.
Yeah, thank you.
In exceptional cases, people may be willing to do that, but as a general principle, faculty do not advise over the summer. So please don't plan to receive feedback in July.
Thank you for clarifying. Yeah. One other thing to keep in mind that's sort of tangentially related to this timeline is the time limits for the DMA degree. So all of the students who are in the session are in your 2nd or 3rd year of the DMA. There is an expectation that you finish all degree requirements for the DMA within 5 years. So quite often when students are in their 5th year and they're trying to finish up their lecture recital, and maybe there was an unexpected interruption or a delay or some challenge that was unforeseen, and they need additional time, the Graduate Oversight Committee, when considering an extension, is certainly going to look at the kind of progress that you've made on the lecture recital project. And if you've been making good, steady progress, I think the committee will be more favorable to giving you an extension. So in the syllabus that I sent you, it articulates the requirements for registering for lecture recital. Number one is in the first semester that you are registered for lecture recital advisement, you have to attend this workshop. So if you're hearing this, then you've already satisfied that requirement. The second one is in your second semester of registering for lecture recital advisement, we're requiring all students to engage with the Rutgers English Language Institute, who has writing coaching courses to help students work on this kind of project. Now, these are, I say courses, but really what they are opportunities to work with a writing coach who can help you to hone your argument, to work on structure, to work out the mechanics of the writing. And in particular, the purpose of this is that it is not the advisor's responsibility to copy edit your work or to go line by line or to engage in that kind of detailed editing. It is much more preferable for you to work with these writing coaches who can help you to hone these skills. Now, you know, for some of you here, a project of this length might be something that is unprecedented in your academic experience. To write a 50 or 60 page paper, maybe you don't have an experience writing something like that. Others of you might have written a master's thesis in a program that you were in previously and have the experience of working on such a extended project. We feel that in both situations, there is quite significant value to working with these writing coaches, that they can both help the students who are struggling to organize the basic elements, and also to help elevate those who for whom writing may come a bit easier. I can only speak from my experience when I was in the DMA. You know, I consider myself a decent writer, but I found this project to be quite overwhelming and demanding, and would have very much welcomed the support of a writing coach while I was writing the paper. So it's something that we expect students will register for in their second semester of lecture recital advisement. It's a 0 credit course, so it's free, and there's no reason to feel that it is should be onerous. It is designed to be helpful for you. And again, the philosophy is that in your first semester, you're primarily doing research and learning about the topic and developing your understanding of the field and your own perspectives. And maybe you'll start your writing in the first semester, but really kind of it's the second semester in which you're doing the bulk of the writing. And that's when these writing coaches will be there to help you on that. So to recap, you have to, number one, do this workshop. In your second semester, you have to register for this free writing coaching course. And then beyond that, it is just expected that in each semester that you're registered for lecture recital advisement, that you are making steady progress on the project that's suitable to wherever you are, whatever stage you're at. And then at the end of the semester, I will get in touch with you to prompt you to submit a progress report that I will be checking against your advisor's commentary. So you'll just have to provide an update at the end of each semester about what you've done and your plan going forward. Does that all make sense? Great. I will assume that all of the names and boxes have just given me thumbs up. The other things that I wanted to say before I turn the mic over is that this project is, in many ways, I mean, it's a research paper, and you've probably written research papers for other classes before, but it's a different kind of project than a term paper for a class, for instance. It's something that is much more substantial. It is your aim to contribute to the field of scholarship, and it is something that reflects your ideas in particular. It is your project. Even if it's, you know, the paper that you're writing on is not some huge revelation that's going to overturn, you know, the world's understanding of the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto or something like that. It still has to lead with your voice, and this is something that you have to cultivate through your research and through the writing process. Additionally, because it's not a term paper and it's more substantial, it's something that requires your forward momentum in working on this project. It is not your advisor's responsibility to be following up with you, to be prompting you. They are there as a resource to you, and they're there to provide suggestions, expertise, guidance when needed, but you have to be the engine that's driving it. So it's important that you make sure that you conceive of the project in that way. Lastly, one other requirement that I forgot to mention before is that you have to be checking in with your advisor at least 3 times in a semester, probably Zoom meetings or extensive email correspondence. It says that in the syllabus, so make sure that you are regularly in touch with your advisor. I would say that's one of the main mistakes that students make, is they go off on the reservation and they will write 20, 25 pages and then drop that in the laps of their advisor, only to find out that there were major problems with the way that they conceived of that section of writing. So all of that can be avoided if you are maintaining regular correspondence and connection with your advisor. And the last thing that I'll say is that while your lecture settle advisor, who's a member of the academic faculty, is the principal resource for you in working on this, I think it's very important that you also keep your applied teacher in the loop about what you're thinking of and where the project is. They probably have more expertise when it comes to the actual repertoire or considerations that have to do with performance, which is also, of course, a part of the final project. So that's just a few things that I wanted to mention about the project. If anyone has any questions about that, you can feel free to unmute and speak up. Otherwise, I will turn it over to my colleagues.
Should I go first, or?
Please.
Yeah, so I guess maybe just to add to Dr. Groman's comments, I'm going to maybe just touch on a few scattered points here, because I think it might be a more useful way to approach things, to have as soon as possible to open up the floor for questions, since we're here.
Nicholas, I have that PDF that we used last year, if that's helpful. Or do you want to just?
Which one is that?
Do you remember? Want me to share my screen? And it was like we had
Forgot about
some
that.
just guidelines. It was in 4 or 5 sections. Do you want to? Would that be helpful, or do you want to?
It's up to you. I mean, I just had maybe a couple of points to talk about.
Okay, yeah, just go for it.
So in my experience, having advised a number of these projects, I think the thing to some of this advice that I'm going to give may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but the main thing I want to stress is that the length of the paper, to the extent that it's possible, should not be the thing that intimidates and should not be the thing that kind of sort of preoccupies your mind. So I'm a big believer in the idea that any writing, however long, however short, in whatever context, is a form of communication. Academic writing has certain expectations, but it is not really as far away from the kind of communication you do in your everyday life as maybe you might think. So, I would just get rid of this mystique of this thing being a long paper, right? And the reason why I say that is because you can say any amount of stuff about any topic if you know what you're going to say, all right? And those of you who have worked with me, sorry, this is a bit of a broken record type of nagging session. But so in other words, actually the most important part of this process is the research portion. And that can be the most frustrating, the most kind of open-ended process, at least at first. But the point I make over and over again to students is that if you do the research well, diligently, and in a kind of organized fashion, the writing, while it still may be challenging, becomes much more manageable. And in my experience, this applies even if you are a student for whom English is a second language. And so a couple of pointers on research. At the very beginning of the process, there is going to be, by necessity, some period of time where your engagement with scholarship on the topic, the general topic you have chosen, is going to be quite open-ended. So that means there is a certain amount of, here are, 30 sources on the vague general area that you are choosing to work on. And your job is really to read as much of that and as you can, read it as well as you can, so that you have a kind of body of knowledge in your head that serves as raw material. It's from that open-ended process that the goal is to arrive at some kind of very, very narrow and focused claim that you're going to make in your paper. So if you're going to write on the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto, right, it is not a 40-page program note, right? You have to say something distinct, something very specific about that piece of music or several pieces of music as as whatever your topic may be. We some time ago, I think, removed the official requirement that the paper make an original argument, which is what is expected for, say, for a musicology student writing a paper of this length. My general strategy is still to ask students to try their best to come up with an original argument. And the reason why I do that is because it's actually easier to write a paper, because the danger if you make a claim that lots of people have made is that you might end up just repeating one or two sources. So even if you don't end up making a claim that's completely original, the topic has to be designed in such a way that even if your basic argument is something that is familiar, you have an opportunity in the paper to synthesize material from a number of different sources, okay? So there is this open-ended period, which is very dangerous, right? Because it can become this excuse for not moving forward with the project. So the balance is to really kind of allow yourself that kind of open-ended reading at the first instance, but also to kind of get to a sort of very narrow topic as soon as that process is done. Once you settle and get approval for a sort of that narrow claim, your thesis, in other words, for your paper, it is likely that you will have to then go and do a little bit more research, okay? Because now you are going and reading things with an eye to looking for evidence to prove whatever it is that you want to prove, all right? So it's a multi-step process. It can seem really tedious, a little frustrating, because it's going, at least at first, it's going to seem a bit directionless. But what I want to stress is really, this is the most important thing in the whole process, right? Because if you do this well, then the writing will simply reflect, this amount of preparation, right? And so don't let the sort of 40-page, 11,000 word thing be the thing that preoccupies your mind, mentally especially. Because if you know your topic well, you will find things to say. And okay, of course, there'll still be things, to work on with the writing. But I have too often seen students sort of not do enough research or not do the research part well enough. And then panic because, there's some kind of deadline that they have to meet and just sort of spew things onto the page, 15 pages of biographical overview. It's all for naught, right? It's all for nothing because that material, just because it's filled 15 pages, may not actually work for the project. So I can't stress enough that the research portion really is absolutely crucial. And the one other thing I will say about that research issue is please don't be do not choose sources or do not find sources just because they are easy to access. So some of your best sources are going to be things that you have to physically go to the library to get, or you may physically have to, or not physically, but you may actually have to get our library to order in for you via interlibrary loan. Okay, I can take some questions about this, but hopefully some of this may have been covered in your research and music class. But just to review a little bit, the most important sort of resources for looking up things in music, I'm going to put them in the chat. The first is the so-called RILM database. You can just search for this on the Rutgers Library website. RILM is the foremost database for scholarship on music that exists. Okay. Your other important resources are Grove Music Online. Okay. Which is the main encyclopedia for music-related issues. This is also available in on the Rutgers website. And the last thing I will mention is that the section of the music library that goes by the call number ML410 is by far the largest section in the music library, because ML410 contains all of the books that are basically about individual composers. And I often find that it is actually much more time efficient to walk to the library and just run your eye down ML410 to see what books there are on a particular composer. We're quite lucky because we have quite a bit of space in our library, unlike some other institutions. We don't keep at the Rutgers Library a lot of material that is off-site. So in other words, if you go physically to the Rutgers Library, to Douglas Library, you will see most, if not all, of the books that the library owns on that subject. And I want to stress this last point, especially the ML410 point, because often if you're starting completely anew from the beginning with the topic, the best places to look are sources that are long. So in other words, books, okay? And or sources that are the most recently written. So if you're working on Mendelssohn, just because Rob used that example earlier, that's the composer that comes to mind, right? Whatever piece it is that you want to write about, or whatever aspect of Mendelssohn's life or music that are tickling your fancy, the first step would be to go check out a bunch of longer books on Mendelssohn. Not necessarily because you have to read them cover to cover, but because those are the books that are going to have a nice little bibliography at the back that you can then use to find other sources, right? So sometimes, I mean, you do have to use databases like Realm. You might have to go to the Grove Music Online encyclopedia entry, but the problem with these large databases is just there's a lot of stuff in there, 90% of which are useless to you, right? They may not be relevant, maybe they're in the wrong language, maybe the computer just pulls up searches that, you know, like search hits that are not, you know, that's, you know, like computers are not as smart as we think they are. So, you know, so if you go to a major book, a longer book, you know, a biography of the composer, some kind of book length study of a composer's, you know, output, that often is one of the easiest places to kind of get going with this task. All right. So I want to stress that just because I know that we live in a time where a lot of stuff is available online. And if you can access something online, great, right? As you know, obviously you don't have to, you know, go to the library just to touch the pages for the sake of doing that. But don't let that be a trap, right? Because sometimes the sources that you might find the most easily may not actually be the ones that are most useful to you. So I'm just going to kind of pause there and then feel free to ask questions and so on.
Thanks, Dr. Chung. One thing that when Dr. Chung was speaking that occurred to me that I should probably mention is kind of the biggest mistake that students sometimes get into, which is the dreaded P word of plagiarism. Unfortunately, there have been instances where students have intentionally or unintentionally run into problems of plagiarism in working on this project. This is a serious problem, and students have been suspended for extended periods of time as a result of this, and I would hate for that to happen to any of you or anyone else. The single greatest thing that you can do is to be really diligent about note-taking, so that way you know where the information that you got comes from, to keep your notes very organized. And the single worst thing that you can do is to have your paper open on one screen and the resource open on the other screen, and to actually type into the paper what you see in the other resource. Of course, you're going to quote things, and of course, there are going to be there's going to be times where you're going to appeal to other scholars' work. That is the natural thing to do, and quite necessary for this kind of a project. But that they should always be properly attributed, either in quotations if you're quoting directly or with a footnote if you're paraphrasing. All this to say, it's something that you should really take very seriously, because the university has to take it quite seriously as well. If you have questions about how to cite something, or whether you're not sure if you need to cite something, you can ask your advisor. It's always better to lead with that, rather than to send them a draft for the advisor to realize, oh, these are paragraphs that are basically taken verbatim. And then the student later tries to say, oh yeah, I was going to add in the footnotes later. Well, at that point, it's too late, and students have gotten into serious trouble for that kind of thing. So I'm not trying to do like a scared straight, scare tactic, but I think that it's something that needs to be, if you are not in the habit of doing this kind of research, you need to have a framework in place for how you take notes, so that way you know where everything came from and you could properly attribute. Nicholas or Scott, do you have anything else to say on that topic? Okay.
Can I just share my screen just to kind of point to something that is that might be helpful with this? Is that okay?
Of course.
Right. Can everybody see a Word document?
Yes.
These are actual notes that I took in writing my dissertation, which is now being turned into a book. One of the things that is really important is that the sooner you can go from a pile of sources, okay, and my usual recommendation is you want like 25 to 35, not all books, but like actually distinct sources. Many of those will be articles. The sooner that you can go from the source to some kind of summary for yourself in bullet points of what that source says, the quicker this process will go. So this, for example, if I'm remembering correctly, is my distillation of a relatively short, like maybe 20-page article into 5 or 6 bullet points for myself. I've identified what the main point is, and then sort of highlighted things in the source that might be interesting to me because of the project that I was doing. This was a project on Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. This note-taking issue is important because in order both for you to figure out a topic, like actually figure out that thesis and that process I was telling you earlier, and then subsequently, as you write, to kind of figure out how to organize your writing, you probably don't want to have 25 books open like on your living room floor, right? So the sooner you can get to the point where you have, each source kind of boiled down to its essentials, the easier it will be for you to organize stuff in your head, right? So like quite literally, so I have 29 pages here of notes. I mean, this is maybe longer than you'll ever need, but like 29 pages of notes on one piece of music where I sort of read almost every single thing that somebody wrote on this piece, okay? Now that might seem long to you, right? But that is much more manageable than to have 35 sources and trying to remember what each source says in your head. So when it actually came time to write, the thing that this, helped me to write, I actually just printed out all 29 pages and I just read my own notes. And it was basically going off these notes that I could organize my ideas, right? So the sources are important, the research is important, but also at a certain point, you have to kind of boil things down for yourself. And this is really what the goal of the process is. I will note maybe just one final thing to kind of connect that with the point that Dr. Groman just made. I am quite careful about stuff like this, right? So if I use a quotation mark, that means there is a quote, right? If there's no quotation mark, that means it's sort of my summary, my paraphrase of whatever the author says. I'm careful about page numbers, that kind of thing. I can't find an example here. But if I insert a comment about the source that is not actually what the source says, it's just sort of my reaction to it, I normally put that in like square brackets. I mean, you can use whatever system you want, but just make sure that this particular stage of the process, you are note-taking accurately to avoid the plagiarism route. Sometimes, and even somebody like me, I have to be quite careful about this. Sometimes you do slip up, okay? But, you know, it's a much more forgivable thing if it's like, it's an accidental lack of a quotation mark on a single sentence, right? It does happen even among professional academics. It's not great, but nobody's perfect. Explicit, like serious plagiarism is when you have like whole paragraphs, which is why I think Dr. Groman's advice about not actually typing out from your, from the source as you write your papers is really, really important.
Thank you. Scott, do you want to go through that document that you had?
Sure, we can touch on a few things. So I put a document in the chat that outlines a lot of what Dr. Chong mentioned so far. That first page really outlines the workflow that we suggest. And particularly when you're getting started, it's super important to be in touch with your advisor, to go through that process and check in at each of the stages that we suggested. So those six bullet points there are the times that we recommend that you set up a meeting, because these are the kind of 6 places that people tend to wander off the path. And if you get too far into this, you run that risk of putting a ton of time and effort into writing 20 or 30 pages only to realize that you're going to have to start all over again. So more check-ins is better. So a question that a lot of students have is how to choose a topic and what makes for a good topic. And my point of view on this may be different than other faculty members, but I'll share with you how I think about this. Presumably you're in a DMA program because you have some interest in combining performance with critical inquiry. You're interested in writing to some extent. You're interested in incorporating thinking and speaking about music into your career above and beyond simply performing. That's a presumption that we have as to why you're in the DMA program. And so as you're thinking about this project, this is a really big calling card for you as you move to the next stage of your career. The ability to say, oh yeah, I wrote my dissertation, or I wrote my lecture recital project on X, Y, or Z topic is a really potent, it's a really powerful calling card that you have as you're either trying to get a teaching job or trying to establish yourself in the field as someone who can do more than just play your instrument well, which a lot of people can do that don't have doctorates. So my suggestion when you're thinking about how to choose a topic, and Rob, this is slide 2 if you want to advance there. I really caution you to avoid a paper that goes along the lines of, I love playing X, Y, or Z piece, and so I'm therefore going to write a paper about X, Y, or Z piece. Because a lot of people will probably also love that piece, and there's nothing particularly original about writing about it. Your originality with respect to the, to standard repertoire will come in your interpretation of it on your instrument or voice, but it's pretty hard to form a kind of interesting argument about standard rep unless you have a really particular point of view on it. Some of the things that we recommend are ideas like exploring a lesser known composer that maybe other performers of your instrument might not have discovered. You could explore a lesser known genre or topic, so like a specific type of music that you think might be interesting for other people to read. You could explore lesser known works by a composer who's well known. If there's a composer who's known primarily for chamber music, but also wrote a little bit of vocal music that nobody really knows about, that can be an interesting thing to talk about. Researching contemporary practice is always a great idea, because if you're working with more recent composers, it's less likely that other scholars have already written everything there is to write about them. We ask that you avoid exclusively pedagogical topics. Forgive the typo there. And so a paper that's just about sort of musculature in piano students, or that's purely about how to teach something to students, is not really what we're looking for in this paper. So this should emerge from your interests as a performer. It should be something that you're excited about spending a year or two really digging into. And it should be something that kind of fits with who you are as a musician. It should be something that's, on brand for you, for lack of a better word, that you can be out there for the next couple of years in your career saying, hey, I'm the specialist in X. Isn't that cool? And imagine, if there are 100 other people that play your instrument, you want to pick something that they're not also likely to be talking about. So this is a real opportunity to distinguish yourself, to develop an area of expertise that makes you interesting and distinctive in a crowded field of performers. Any questions on things that might make it good topic? Does anyone have ideas that they've been thinking about that we could, that we could get some feedback on right at the moment? Can be helpful to have a specific example when it comes to talk about what makes for a great topic or how a topic could be better.
Yeah, I think it would be great if we could actually go around. This is a small enough session and we have some time remaining. Maybe we could call on some people in the some of the students to share sort of where their thinking is at. Wu, you're first on my screen. Do you want to share a little bit about what your thoughts are about a topic or where you're at in the process?
Yes, I kind of looked up through like Willem and maybe some other platforms, like if there's any material already on Izai being a mixture of Bach and Paganini, and I was pleasantly surprised to find that there was basically no material on that subject. So I'm really fascinated by Izai, and so I did really want to write about him. I know that there's so much material on him already though, so that kind of discouraged me from going into the topic, which then gave me an alternative for Bartók's solo sonata for violin, which doesn't have material. At least it doesn't have a lot of material on.
Wu, with your first topic, you said Izai as a mixture of Bach and Paganini. What is if someone challenged you about what that means, what would you say? What do you mean by that?
Well, it takes like he wrote 6 sonatas kind of in the model of how Bach wrote 6, partitas and sonatas for violin, and they're formulated in kind of a Baroque, form. Like there's like a partita-like form that he just sectionalized like certain sonatas in. So, and then he takes the virtuosity of Paganini. So it's all just like new sonorities within older forms, basically. Yeah, that's how I would explain it.
Can I just interject? And I just wanted to
Yes.
use the example that you've given just as a kind of demonstration example for your colleagues on the call. The sooner that you can get everybody to the kind of question that was just formulated, right? So beyond just, I'm sort of interested in this work, or I'm sort of interested in this genre, or I'm sort of interested in this composer, the sooner you can get into a narrow place, right? Where I'm saying, I'm actually, there's this is very specific thing about this composer that I want to ask. The easier the process becomes, right? So in other words, it's not just about Izai, but there's something I want to, there's something I want to test about whether or not it may be true, right? With Izai, right? Can you in fact think of his work as being this combination of 2 influences? The sooner you can get to that point, the quicker and the more efficient the research process becomes. Even if, and again, this is where the frustration, even if that topic ends up not being maybe as doable as you thought at first, right? Maybe you might have to refine it, maybe you have to change gears. But it's sort of like this, the quicker you can get away from the sort of swimming in the large ocean feeling in research, right? It's just, I have no idea what I'm going to talk about. All I know is I'm interested, the narrower you can get, the quicker it's going to be. So I'm glad that, you brought up that experience, because I think it's a good example of like in among scholars, we call it a research question, right? So it's a very, very, in some ways, like the toughest thing is to figure out what are the questions I want to ask.
Yeah.
And sometimes if you come in and you haven't hit on that yet about a topic, it takes some time to even formulate that. But when you get that question, all of a sudden the process becomes simpler.
Another thing I would add, and I think that that question about Isaiah is actually, could really work. As an alternative, just for everyone, keep in mind that your paper doesn't have to be about a composer, or that the main organizing principle of your paper doesn't have to be focused on a composer. It could be focused on an idea. So I'm, for example, advising a paper right now on the subject of piano works that incorporate multimedia. So this paper contrasts 5 different works for piano and video, and sort of examines the way the video and the piano interact. And it's really interesting. And by virtue of the fact that it's combining these 5 different works, no one's ever written about those 5 people before. So it's sort of inherently original right off the bat. You could write about a paper about composers for your instrument who are influenced by architecture. You could write a piece about composers for your instrument who were inspired by landscape and the natural world. You could write a piece about composers who all studied at some school at some particular time in history and influenced each other. You could write about composers that share a particular identity feature. You could write about a genre of music. So you could write about, for example, late 19th century works that are influenced by Bach, or that late 19th century works with Baroque characteristics for your instrument. So don't be limited to think, well, I have to write about this one person, because that can be a really, really tough one to do, because for every major composer, there's an army of scholars who have glommed onto it and written a lot of stuff. So if you can formulate your topic around an idea, that can also be a slightly easier path to that original claim or that original argument.
I think those are great points. You could even take certain characteristics of pieces. You could write about pieces, when my colleagues and I have written questions for the DMA piano comprehensive exam, we often try to look at the same repertoire, but from a different kind of angle. So one of the years, my colleagues wrote a question that was asking students to explore the idea of humor in piano music. So something like that, examining pieces that are intentionally humorous, or pieces that are inspired by dance, or in pieces that try to imitate the sounds of other instruments, or all these kinds of things. They're all different ways to sort of slice and dice our main body of repertoire, and can yield a very interesting, unique kind of paper that, it's, and then you could be the, the music and architecture guy, right? You could be, the humor in piano sonatas kind of guy, when you take your talk on tour.
This leads to another point that I think we didn't mention last time, but I think is really worth talking about, which is your audience. When you're writing, it's really useful to think about who's on the other end of this paper. And a mistake that a lot of writers fall into, that we have to work out in the advising process, but which I think is pretty avoidable, is that they imagine their audience to be someone who's never heard of George Gershwin, for example. And so they start by saying, let me think, let's just say Beethoven. And they say Beethoven was a German composer who lived in the 19th century. He was most famous for his Ode to Joy, or whatever. And it starts from this very, very broad biographical point of view. The easiest way to avoid this is imagine that your audience are other people who are earning DMAs on your instrument, because that is literally who reads these. That's who would be the audience for this paper, or other people who are serious and thoughtful performers on your instrument. These are not going to be read by the general public. They're not going to be reprinted in the New Yorker. And they're probably not going to be read by professional musicologists unless you've really cracked something open. The people to whom this document will be legitimately useful will be other intellectually minded, critically engaged performers on your instrument. So if you're writing about Beethoven, you can skip all the stuff that everyone else in our field already, you can skip all the stuff that all your friends already know about Beethoven. Get right to the bit where you think, okay, well, I'm actually going to tell you something about Beethoven that the other people in my DMA program probably don't know. Or at least that's how I think about the audience. Is that kind of how you think about it, Nicholas?
Absolutely. I mean, my reference point would be like sort of professional journals for high-level performers, especially high-level performers who teach in higher education. So choral journals, the one I'm most familiar with in choral conducting. I think there are equivalents and for other instruments and other fields. What I will want to maybe want to add is a couple of things. The first is I've advised, because of the research that I do, mainly on the kind of Austro-German canon. I advise a lot of projects that are actually on very familiar composers. And you would be surprised what hasn't been done. So professional musicology, like any academic discipline, has a herd mentality. So when certain pieces get attention, right, by a famous composer, scholars then keep going back to the same piece or the same type of piece. And, especially if you are working on music that is not for violin, strings, or orchestra. So often pieces for clarinet, flute, I mean, those actually get a lot less attention than you might think, because the questions that performers want to ask about some of these things are quite different from what scholars want to ask sometimes. So I would not go in assuming that just because, you're interested in Brahms, that all is lost, okay? In fact, there's actually, the literature on Brahms symphonies is thinner than you think. I learned this planning a seminar for, it's just kind of surprising, some of these things. You just don't know until you find out, right? Which is why I stressed earlier that the hardest thing is to kind of get going and just spend a lot of time on databases and flipping through books, right? It's not sexy work, but it's necessary to get there. And then maybe the one other thing maybe I could mention to get you to think about, this advice does not work for everybody, but I think it's useful to think about. I have sometimes told students to think about this project much more as an academic project than it is a project that's necessarily that comes out of the performer side of your identity. And that advice is because sometimes the topic that works best as a paper may not be the repertoire that you in your heart of hearts want to play in a concert, right? So you shouldn't take that advice too extreme. You obviously don't want to just, completely, kind of cut yourself out. But sometimes, right, your favorite piece of music or your favorite piece, or your favorite composer may not in fact be the thing that kind of works the best in terms of research, okay? On the flip side, the other extreme to avoid is to ensure that whatever repertoire you wish to work on can be viable as a program for the recital portion of the lecture recital. So I think these are the kind of two extremes, right? You don't want it to just be a recital, because then maybe the paper might not be, the kind of recital you want to play. If it was just a recital, is not necessarily the thing that might work best as a paper. But you also don't want to write a paper where it might be hard to put together a viable program. And I have struggled with this, especially for instruments that have less of a solo or chamber music repertoire. You just want to make sure that you have a pragmatically speaking, a program that might be viable, even if you don't have to have it set in stone right away.
Thank you.
I have to go at the top of the hour. Are there any questions that people have in the last couple minutes that we have together?
Yes, I have a question about self-plagiarism. I recently heard about somebody who is going through something like that, and I'm just wondering if it's okay that we recycle material that we ourselves wrote in the past. And
so this is a great question. I'm glad that you brought it up. I actually thought about it as I was driving to the office today to mention it in the session and just forgot. Yeah, self-plagiarism is an issue. So for those of you who don't know, the most egregious example of self-plagiarism is using a paper that you wrote for one class for another class without actually discussing it with the instructor. In general, it's just not, it's expected that you would write an original new paper for each course that requires a paper. So to use a paper that you've written previously is deceptive in that way. Now, it's quite often that students who are engaging in the lecture title project will expand on a topic that they've written before. This is entirely acceptable as long as you're transparent about it with your advisor. If you are discussing with your advisor, you say, hey, I wrote this 10-page paper on this topic previously, I kind of wanted to expand it. That's a very reasonable thing to do. And I'm sure Dr. Chung, in converting his own dissertation into a book, is starting from the place of everything that he's written already. This is something that is totally fine as long as it's done out in the open, transparently, and with the blessing of the advisor. I could envision situations in which an advisor might be more lukewarm to it. Perhaps if the original paper that you've written only requires minimal expansion to reach the stated minimums for the lecture recital paper, I could imagine your advisor saying, yes, this is not such a good idea. Maybe you could use a portion of this and then take it in another direction. That's something that you have to discuss with your advisor. I appreciate that you're aware of this and thinking about this. The moral of the story is that being open and transparent and asking for permission based on the specifics of your situation, you're never going to go wrong that way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just share the paper with your advisor and say, hey, I was thinking about expanding this. What do you think? And you're good from that point onward.
Just to clarify, the issue with self-plagiarism when somebody uses a paper twice for two different classes is a kind of a separate category, actually, because the issue there is somebody has essentially gotten extra academic credit for not doing extra work. With the lecture recital paper, because it's a kind of independent research project, the ethics are a bit different. I mean, in terms of you are allowed to expand a paper you've written previously. Especially if it's not published, so it's not published work. So it's like with somebody recycling a paper, it's less of a kind of like you copied yourself problem than it is like you didn't do the work problem, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
The one thing that I'd caution about this is that it may be the case that a term paper that you wrote for a course might not be the suitable basis for an expansion into a lecture recital topic. There's just more substantive expectations about what this project entails. And therefore, if you've done previously, I might say pejoratively, a book report for a previous paper, where you're just saying, Malcolm Bilson said this thing, and I'm going to summarize it. That's not a very good basis for expanding into a lecture recital paper.
Any other questions before the top of the hour?
I have one more question for somebody who cannot contribute to the Zoom. She's wondering if she can finish her LRA in one semester instead of like two. Is that?
It's certainly possible. It's been done before. There's no rule against it. But one other thing that might echo off what Dr. Ordway is saying previously about the expectations of your advisor, and I laid this out in the syllabus. You cannot have an expectation that your advisor will be able to prioritize your work on a very short time frame. You should allot at least a few weeks for substantial writing, because it's just so if you or your colleague has an expectation, oh, I'm going to finish this in one semester, and you drop a 60-page paper on the lap of your advisor in mid-April, I gotta say it's putting
Not going to happen.
Yeah, it's just expecting too much of the advisor, and I'm eager to protect the faculty members' time. There have been too many situations in which students have said, oh, I really need to get this degree by this time so that way I can get this job that's been offered to me, but haven't planned accordingly and therefore put our colleagues into difficult situations. So keep that in mind. Any other questions before we wrap up?
I have a couple of things to add to that, but I just want to make sure that anybody who wants to ask Dr. Ordway specifically a question gets to do so, because I know he has to run. I can stay for a few more minutes if, yeah, so I'm not under pressure. Otherwise, I will.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Scott.
All right. Yeah,
So-
no problem. Feel free to anyone feel free to reach out to me via email. Happy to help if I can. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of mention with the etiquette issue, how long faculty members, I don't know how explicit this is in the syllabus. So normally if you submit a full draft of something, minimum, we need 2 weeks to read it. I would ask that you be charitable, especially if it's at a different time of semester, but 2 weeks is the kind of minimum. So just bear that in mind, like when you work on things and in terms of planning your own timeline, especially if you feel you have to get things done soon. The other practical matter to note is that in the spring, if you graduate in the spring, I believe there are these weird rules about when you have to kind of finish all degree requirements, which are much earlier. I'm sure there are bureaucratic reasons for this that I don't understand. But it ends up meaning that in practice, you only have half the spring semester to really work on this, just because all degree requirements have to be done by April 1st or 15th. I can't even remember.
April 15th.
Yeah, but yeah, but that means the recital has to be by April 1st, ish, because there are, you might have to do oral exam and so on. So in other words, like, that's probably like the main reason why the one semester thing is so difficult to do, even if you're a very diligent student and it's the only thing that's going on. But yeah, there are these so bureaucratic rules. Just bear that in mind. The one other thing I wanted to mention, kind of in relation to the thing I talked about right at the beginning about research being the most important part of the process. One of the challenges I have found with some students is if you end up moving away from campus as you are working on this project, and I understand that people have personal and financial situations that I definitely have, completely understand that. You do need to think very carefully about how that would impact your ability to get the resources you need to finish this project, right? So if you're living in a place like New York City, pretty much everything you might need, it could actually be sourced from the New York Public Library, because New York Public Library has a really excellent research collection. It may be a public library, but it is also a research library. That's not true of every place in the country or indeed the world. We've had students move out to California, and I start shaking and being very, very worried about how people can do that. There might be ways to kind of get access to libraries at local universities, in which case, then maybe you'll be fine. I would also double check what Rutgers is. I don't know if they're still mailing books to people. At one point during the pandemic, I think they were willing to do that. Check with the librarians, please. But whatever happens, please do bear that in mind as you make decisions, which I understand are important life decisions, right? People have different commitments, be that family, professional, financial, or otherwise. But we can't square the circle, right, so to speak, right? So like you do need access to the books. Depending on your topic, you may actually have to get books physically from a library. Not everything is going to be available online. So please bear that in mind as you make decisions, of this nature. It can also serve as an incentive to finish this sooner rather than later, because obviously you don't want to be stuck living near campus if this is the only thing that's left on your plate, so to speak. Okay.
Yeah, in particular, students who have moved back to China or back to Korea, I mean, it has caused major challenges and major headaches and just weakened the overall quality of the paper that they could produce because they don't have access to these things. So certainly something to keep in mind.
Exceptions were made during the pandemic, but
Yeah.
this had already been an issue, I think, before then. So we just wanted to bear that in mind. Yeah.
So I'm aware of the time, and I think that we should wrap up. If any of you have any further questions, you can, of course, email me, email Dr. Chung, Dr. Ordway. We're happy to help and provide more suggestions and guidance. But I'm hopeful that the comments that they had earlier were helpful. I think that these are really important things to keep in mind, and hopefully have given you some direction and some hope about tackling this project. All right. If anyone has any last minute questions, we could stick around. Otherwise, good luck as you embark on this project.
Thank you so much.
Of course. All right.
Thank you,
Take care.
Professor. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.